Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Bass Fishing for Noobs here on the Paddle and Fin podcast. I'm your host, Sean. My co host, Susie, is again busy this evening. She is getting things prepped for the Dale Hollow tournament, I believe. So she's going to skip out tonight, but hope to have her on again next week. But that being said, I wanted to highlight that I guess this show will air on Monday, and the following Wednesday evening, actually Thursday, I will be heading down to Dale Hollow to meet up with the rest of the Paddle and Fin crew, those who can make it. There is going to be quite a few of the hosts there this year again. And this weekend or the following weekend, so the April 22nd and 23rd, we will be having the Dale Hollow Open again. So I'm super excited to make that trek down there again. I just looked, I think it's a 11 or 12-hour drive for me. So it's a little bit of a hike, but I'm bringing my own kayak this year after pedaling on Old Town last year and feeling totally awkward not having my Hobie. So I'm going to drive again this year. And that way, if I lose any rods, Brian, then I won't feel so bad about losing somebody else's rods because that was pretty embarrassing. But anyway, so if you guys can make it, or if you're at all interested, we'd love to have as many listeners come out for that tournament as possible. Even if you don't want to fish the tournament, you can come out and hang out with us. Just get to know the crew in person. We'd love to get to meet as many listeners as possible and just, share in the fun times that we always have down there. So super excited to be going there coming up next weekend. Again, I know some of the crew will be down early next week. Myself, I'll be heading down on Thursday. My daughter's having foot surgery, so I had to hang around a little bit longer here at home while she works that out. But anyway, that's the kind of getting you guys all caught up on that. So super excited for that. But that's not the reason we're here tonight. So I was looking for guests, and I happened upon a message way back when Ryan had decided to leave the podcast. I had quite a few people reach out and ask potentially about co-hosting, and this gentleman was one of the people who had reached out, and that was kind of before Susie decided that she wanted to get back into the podcast game. And so I never really got to dig further into the opportunity for other people to co-host, but he was one of the gentlemen that reached out. And so after looking around and kind of reading through his profile and stuff and seeing, we don't get a lot of anglers on here from the Pacific Northwest. And I like to get, kind of a take on everybody around the country because Paddle and Fin is bigger than just we have a bunch of people from Ohio, we have myself from Pennsylvania, we have some Texas people, Jimmy and those guys are down in the Florida, Alabama kind of area. So but we just don't hear a lot from the Pacific Northwest. So I wanted to have this guest come on. He has been on Paddle and Fin before. He was on Armando's show, the Best Kayaking and Beers show, back when he was still with Paddle and Fin. So he's not a total newbie for Paddle and Fin, but this is the first time on the Noobs show. So I wanted to take a second and welcome Mr. Luke Johnston. How's it going, sir?
Thanks, Sean. Thanks for having me, man.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, glad to have you. And again, super happy to have you on. What did you talk about with Armando?
Man, I don't know, just fishing in general. I don't really recall exactly what the conversation was, but
Okay.
eh,
Yeah.
yeah, I just reached out to him saying, "Hey, man, it'd be cool to talk to you about fishing on the show." So, yeah,
I always
I
I
don't
always
recall
liked
the
Armando's
specifics.
show. Yeah, like the different way stories that he'd draw out of people and stuff. Definitely had some good stuff. So I'll have to go back and dig through the archives and find that one.
For
But
sure.
um, but yeah, so for the folks who might have missed that one or aren't familiar with you, why don't you let them know who you are, kind of where you're from?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I'm from, well, kind of the Portland area, generally Portland, Oregon. Grew up here in a small town, kind of near here, uh, and yeah, I've lived here basically my whole life. Um, Yeah, and I love it here.
Gotcha.
It's a really great place to live and to
Cool.
fish
And
especially.
I was just gonna say, and what's your fishing story? How'd you get into fishing, and how'd that come about?
Yeah, just as a kid, there's so many trout streams here, especially so on the west side of the state, the east side too, but the west side I'm most familiar with. Pretty much any creeks or river. you know, if there's water, there's probably trout, and mostly on this side of the state, um, it's it's cutthroat trout. And so, as a kid with a rooster tail lure, a spinner, right? Rooster tail for me explicitly, and I still use them today. That and a single rod with, who knows what, 6 pound mono on it, go down to the river and catch trout. And that was a ton of fun. And there was a little lake nearby as well that they'd stock trout in, which is common around here still to this day. They stock like, full 8 to 10 inch trout, rainbow trout in that case, but go and catch them on power bait and things
Oh
like
yeah.
that. Yeah.
That sounds very similar to Pennsylvania. They kind of do a lot of that similarly here. I just took my daughter. We have a youth mentor day where the adults are supposed to not fish a whole lot. You basically you take your kid fishing, and so I took my daughter out and we did the whole power bait and split shot and went to town, and she caught three and was happy. So I was happy, and but yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
That now when you say lake fishing, is that like big lakes or like what's the water like? I know you mentioned when we talked before the show about the Columbia River, and finally I can talk to someone who has a river that's at least comparable to it's not the 300-yard wide, at the widest point, little river that some of my guests talk to. So
Yeah, I was actually catching up a little bit on some of your episodes from before, just to kind of get the vibe, and you were talking to, I think, a guide from the Susquehanna and talking about how it's a mile wide. And yeah, for sure, the Columbia River is absolutely a mile wide in many places. Um, yeah, and I didn't really fish the Columbia River much till a lot more recently. As a kid, it was little lakes and ponds and stuff that they'd stock, and rivers and things like that. But really, what after high school, I quit fishing for probably 8 to 10 years, something like that.
mhm.
Through college and early adulthood, and then I don't know, about 2015, maybe something like that. I kind of got this itch, and I didn't have any gear at all. I mean, literally nothing. And so I went to Cabela's, I guess, and bought like probably a $40 spinning combo, a pre-spooled and everything, that kind of deal. And I think though I had the intention of fishing for bass, which I had done very little as a kid and had some success, but not really. That wasn't my thing, but it just seemed like fun. So anyway, that and probably a pack of Senkos and some worm hooks, and headed out. We have a lake kind of nearby here. It's technically a reservoir, I guess, but um, and yeah, and went and caught some bass, and that was just exhilarating, just from shore, like in the grass. Uh, and when I say grass, I mean like if it wasn't a lake, it would be like prairie grass. Like it would be like you could harvest hay from it. You know what I mean? Like
Wow.
out of a
Okay.
hayfield. That when we talk about grass up here, I think like that's what we're talking about. Grass, like real, like
Okay.
from your yard grass almost. Not like hydrilla and stuff. Although that does exist, but a lot of our lakes are at least our reservoirs are like they used to be prairies, and now they're
Okay.
used for irrigation, drinking water, things like that. So grass still grows at least on the edges.
Interesting.
Um, yeah. So you know, what happened was I was fishing and I noticed this huge chunk of grass like in the distance that I couldn't get to. There was really no way to get there without hiking down like a crazy big embankment. And I was like, I need to get over there, and that's where kayak came in. And
Gotcha.
yeah, just needed access. I didn't know that kayak fishing was a thing. I hadn't dug that deep. It was just I needed some way to float over there. You know,
Gotcha. So what'd you start out with?
a some kind of sit inside Pelican, $200, probably $300 total with a paddle and a life jacket kind of situation,
Gotcha.
with
Gotcha.
strapped to my Honda Civic on foam blocks. Like I had no idea what it would lead to.
The ends justify the means, man,
Yep, that's it.
And so what are you fishing out of now? What have
I've
you
got a I've got a Old Town PDL 120.
okay. I shouldn't have busted on that then when I mentioned that doing that last year at Dale Hollow, because I think
Oh,
that might be the exact boat that I was in last year in Dale Hollow. But
I love
uh
it.
you know what? By the end of, I think I fished out of it the 3 days I was down there, and by the end of it, I thought it was fine. It was just that first initial getting used to a circular, um, pedaling motion
Oh,
when
right.
I was so used to the Hobie just back and forth. I felt like totally uncoordinated. I'm like, I can't make this go. And but yeah, by the end I was doing fine. It was just that initial learning curve that my muscle memory was so trained to that back and forth motion that when I actually got to pedaling it, and it was silly because Jimmy had mentioned, oh, he's like, oh, I can get you an Outback. We'll bring an Outback, and I was like, oh, no, I'll try, because Brian had mentioned, oh, I have a uh, an Old Town that you can use, and I was like, yeah, I have never pedaled anything but other than a Hobie, so I was like, maybe I should try it. In hindsight, that probably wasn't the best idea to just try for a weekend where I had no other options, but
Hmm.
uh, it definitely made me realize that I do love my Hobie. But to each their own. I can't say that I hated it. It just felt alien to me. So
Yeah, I tried a Hobie when I was looking at the Old Town, um, and it was fine. I mean, there was nothing. Yeah, I don't know. I think my tipping point on whether I went with the Hobie or the Old Town was probably cost at the time. Just they're a bit bigger of an investment, and
yeah,
that was just
no,
and that wasn't the 360 one. I don't think it was out at the time. It may have been, but it
gotcha.
was fresh. It was new and quite a bit more expensive, obviously. So
Well, even my Outback when I bought it, I think it was 2,700, and I traded in a Jackson Kusa HD, and then also used some inheritance money that my grandmother had left for me to kind of make up the cost. And now an Outback's like 3,500. So I feel
yeah,
lucky that I got in when I did, because they've gone up in price crazy. And I always joke with people, I have an iPhone, but other than that, like computer wise, I always joke about Macs being, like, you pay an extra grand for the Apple logo on your device. And, but the kind of the same thing can be said about Hobie. You slap a Hobie logo on something and you can add 50% to the cost pretty much. So,
yeah. But one thing about the Outback that I really loved was that it just seemed like it was just like there was a place for everything immediately, and there wasn't much need for the angler or the user, to like retrofit anything. It
mhm.
was all right there. There's little, lanyards and retractors and the track system, and it was just boom. It's like, here you go, it's ready to go. Throw your fish finder on there, maybe grab a rod and you're fishing. Whereas the Old Town, I think they could make some changes, like a rear gear track, for example. I installed one. It's like, I know they were trying to, it was trying to be at a market point that maybe wasn't as expensive, but it's like
Mhm.
those kinds of things. It's like all this flat surface area on the Old Town, and there's no track. And then the front has plastic tracks. It would be nice if they were metal, which you can buy aftermarket ones, and install them. People have made them. But in any case, I love it. Man, I went from the sit inside, whatever that was, Pelican, to a uh, Vibe Yellowfin 100,
Okay.
which was 10 feet. And when I bought it, I had and I didn't get to test it, which was problematic. So anybody listening, make sure you test them. They're, that wasn't that huge of an investment. I think it was maybe $700 at the time, but still, I mean, it's not cheap. I thought I could stand in it, and it turns out I couldn't stand in it. So it didn't really change my fishing all that much. I mean, it was more, it had some rod holders. It had a rear tank well area where I could put a crate a little better. But overall, I still had to sit all day. And when I fish, when I go out, I usually get 1 day a week. I like to make it at least 8 hours if I can.
Mhm.
And to physically sit for 8 hours and not stretch your legs is brutal. So I'd find
Oh yeah.
myself like getting up on shore and just stretching for 10 minutes. But now in the Old Town, I can stand. I can basically dance in it. It's great. I love it.
Yeah. There that it was very stable, and that was, I've heard that complaint about Outbacks, but I don't know if just because I'm only 5'7", I'm kind of on the smaller size, and I've never had problems standing in the Outback. But then when I go to something like a PA or the bigger boats, then I'm like, these things are like, I'm like, you'd almost have to try to tip these things. It's um, now, obviously, I know I've heard people tip in the PAs, and I've come close a few times in my Outback, but knock on wood, I have not. rolled it yet on purpose, or by accident. I've done it on purpose just to make sure I could flip it and get back in and everything. But yeah, that's it. And I can say, I felt totally secure in the old town. And now you said, you say you like standing up, would you say you do that quite a bit, or more just to stretch your legs every now and then?
No, I do it quite a bit. Um, it's tough though with the wind, you know. I mean, if I
Mhm.
had a motor like spot lock or something, then yeah, sure, I'd probably stand up all the time, like if I was on the front of a boat. Um, but if like let's say I'm going down a bank and the wind is blowing me just right where I can stand, and say I'm like fishing a spinnerbait maybe, or a swim jig or swim bait, something like a moving bait like that, and I can, and it's just right, like sure, I'll go the entire stretch as far as I can standing. It's nice. It's I don't know. It's fun.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I was thinking about that same thing. When you get into those perfect drift situations where you can do that. I mean, there's a lot of techniques that are so much easier to do when you're standing.
Yeah.
I think in jerkbait especially, that was one
Right.
of the hardest things for me to learn to do seated, was to work a jerkbait. When the conditions don't permit. But man, doing just being able to stand to do that, or be any technique that where you want to keep the rod tip low, even like I prefer when I am running a crankbait to keep my rod tip low like that. And so
Yep.
any of those techniques like that, being able to stand is definitely a bonus. So
Yeah, actually, you know, or not crankbait, sorry, jerkbait is something that I still don't fish that often for that reason. It's not that often where I'm able to stand and fish, um, and with enough balance and no wind and everything like that. So anyway, yeah, it's really tough. And the other thing about a jerkbait that I still haven't mastered is the right retrieve speed with my reel to keep up with the jerks and not get like weird little bubbles in my line and things like that, especially if I'm fishing any kind of bait caster that has braid. And so it's a lot more able to like flip out of your reel in a kind of weird, and then you get little weird bubbles that and loops that wrap in each other. And so anyway, that's I'm not much of a jerk bait guy.
I am very jealous of people who can do that as well. I will say though, having watched Jeff Little, I know we've had him on the show quite a bit.
Mm,
He fishes jerk baits on spinning rods, and if you ever want to
yeah,
watch somebody use a jerk bait seated on a kayak, go watch. Just Google Jeff Little jerk bait, and he's had entire episodes where he does nothing but jerk bait fishing seated with a spinning rod on a kayak. So
nice.
if you're ever interested, again, I still have problems, like you said, keeping up with the line management with the reel while you're jerking, but it's definitely if you ever want to find anybody who knows or is a good example of how to do it, I'd say check that out. So
Yeah, that's what I've had to resort to, honestly, a lot of times is just put it on a spinning rod.
yeah, yeah,
Not my favorite.
no.
No, it's
So
okay.
while we're on that topic, what are some of your favorite techniques?
Well, if I just need to catch a fish, number one would be a Ned rig. Um, you know, not it's not that exciting, but it's caught so many fish and some really good ones. And I do want to get into fishing on the Columbia River, as we talked about before, and
Oh
that
yeah,
just
yeah.
you know out there especially is just like caught so many good fish on it. So that one, but I think that one's probably been beat to death on how to fish it well. I think another one that I love, is a spinnerbait, and in that similar vein, I know I had mentioned is kind of a swim jig with like a swim bait style swim jig, not a craw, but like
Mhm.
a paddle tail on there. Is a lot of fun. And so with those, so especially coming up pretty close to now, and maybe in the next probably month. Um, so where I'm at on the Columbia River, there's they've built a freeway on one side and then train tracks on the other. Um, and and actually, I should take a step back. So the Columbia, where I fish, is above the first dam. And because so the Columbia was dammed up in multiple places. If you look at it on the map, I mean, it goes all the way up into Canada, and there's all kinds of dams all along it that are mostly for hydroelectricity.
Okay.
And so it basically makes a whole bunch of reservoirs, like a chain of reservoirs that go throughout it, and some places aren't dammed up, or like the current actually flows. But in any case, so that's basically a huge reservoir that I'm in, but with current, and that current though it changes um, at any given time based on the draw from the dam.
Yep.
And mostly that's hydroelectrics, like I said. So a lot of it is electricity demand, where it's like, oh, this is the middle of the day on a summer day. They need more power, so there's more current than if it's, you know, 8 a.m. that same day. So I can be out there at launch in the summertime, and the current's completely different from, like I said, 8 to 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It'll change, um, and not like immediately, but over time.
Right.
So anyway, so that's something to pay attention to. But so what happened though is when they dammed up the river, became this huge lake, and on one side there's a freeway, and on the other side there's some train tracks. And when they built all that, there's a ton of riprap that's created these, kind
Nice.
of like, I don't know, 45-degree walls. And then maybe, I'm not sure exactly, but maybe because they had to dredge a little bit on the edges or something. In some places, there's these like little troughs just before the wall. And in the springtime, the bass will get in this like against the rock, but in a little bit deeper. It might be like 5 feet and then 8 feet and then goes up the wall onto the rock. And if you can find one of those little places, and throw spinner baits in there, swim jigs, chatter baits, a plain swim bait, just a paddle tail swim bait. That can be a lot of fun, and it can be a whole day pattern to just find these walls and run them. You know, three, four, five
Absolutely.
of them in a day. It's great fun.
Okay. I was curious about that, like what kind of structure and stuff you have on that river, because the Susquehanna is similar in that respect, in that we do have quite a few different hydroelectric dams. I probably have within 50 miles of me probably three places
Okay.
where the river is completely dammed, and same thing. If they're drawing, flow to kind of create the power, the river can fish completely different.
Yep.
It can be dang near stagnant at times, hardly moving at all. And then they'll open the gates. I've actually been pretty close. There's bright, big flashing lights and a siren that actually goes when they open the gates, so that you get a little bit of time to get away from the dam when that happens. But it does make quite a bit of difference. And like you said, I mean, the river can change especially if you say, you fish, try to fish like 8-hour days out there. If they, start drawing in the midday, it can be completely different from the morning to the afternoon about, how the river's fishing. So,
Yeah. Yeah. It can really go from almost a lake to a river, but it's a river like you're not going to find ripples or anything like that. I mean, we're talking like, this thing's probably, you know easily 60 feet deep. There's 80-foot holes. It's probably 100 feet deep. In some spots, I mean, I've not crossed it in my kayak, but I know I mean, it's huge. There's some
okay.
huge deep holes. And so you're not going to find, when they start drawing water, riffles necessarily, but you'll notice around any kind of island or point that, it's going. Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. Well, that is a little different then, because the joke about the Susquehanna, it's a mile wide but a foot deep.
mm,
So it does get, there are a few places where I'd say it gets down to 30, 40, but it's definitely way more of the, especially in the summertime where it's a foot deep,
oh,
or
wow.
2 foot, or some places like the more lakey areas are 15, 20 regularly. But those are also the places where all the boaters and the jet skiers and the water tubers are. So it's just not the easiest place to fish anyway. And knowing that they can't be in the really shallow stuff, the 2 foot stuff, that's kind of where I spend a large majority of my time, just because I know I don't have to worry about somebody barreling me over. Uh, but
Yep. I've
what's
dealt with that.
I was
Absolutely.
gonna say, what's your recreational traffic like out there? Is it a big thing?
Well, so the Columbia, not much, at least where I'm at. Now you can fish the lower river. I say lower, I mean there's a lot of water between the ocean and the first dam. Probably like 100 miles, 200 miles, I don't know. It's a lot of water, but near the Portland area, like I drive probably an hour and 20 minutes to get to where I fish typically. So I'm fishing probably 50 minutes outside of Portland, something like that. I live a little
Okay.
further. And in the Portland area, there's a lot more boat traffic, but I also don't fish down there that often because in that area, there's, at least from what I've seen, there hasn't been the same structure that I like to fish as there is a little further up. So that's why I travel further. However, to switch gears a little bit to a different river, there's the Willamette River that flows only in Oregon. It flows from like kind of central Western Oregon north and meets the Columbia, and that one flows directly through downtown Portland. And there, the population, I mean, we were like 2 million people or something in the metro area,
Wow.
and there's middle of July, August. I get there before sunrise, and I'm usually done by 1 o'clock because it's pure chaos. I
Hmm.
mean, jet skis and tubers, and it's a lot. So there's plenty of fish to be caught, but I don't want to deal with all the people. So I'm usually done. It, and plus it's getting super hot at that point a lot of days anyway. So it's time to get off
Gotcha.
the water.
Gotcha. Okay. And I know we talked a little bit before when we first talked about kind of the things we are going to talk about. You mentioned that the smallie fishing in the Columbia River is really good, and I was kind of curious what other species are out there. I know not everybody targets them, but I was just curious. Like I said when I was talking to you here in Pennsylvania, we're mostly largemouth, smallmouth as far as bass are concerned. There's a few places we can go to get stripers, but that's kind of as far as bass are concerned, what we're limited to now. We can get the pike and muskie occasionally around, and catfish obviously, but
Yeah, there's a lot. And first let me say though, on the smallmouth specifically, uh, it's absolutely epic. Really, I think like the Columbia especially is probably, I mean, I haven't fished a lot of other places for smallmouth, but it's probably one of the best in the country if you match it up. I mean, we just have epic days. I mean, like a small fish out there, I feel like is about 14 inches. So
nice.
like they're just all good fish, and it's a lot of fun. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that yesterday my buddy caught, it was 21 and a quarter, but he carries a scale, and it was 5 pounds 14 ounces. It
Wow.
was the biggest fish, like, it was a massive fish, so, like, we really have great smallmouth fishery, and so, anyway, come and check it out, like, anybody, or get out there, um, but aside from that, I mean, we're really known as a cold water area, for most fish, historically, so that's, your trout, rainbow trout, cutthroat trout. If there's a river, it's got trout in it, probably, around here. But then salmon, all different variations of salmon that come in from the Pacific Ocean. Steelhead, which are, they're different from the Great Lakes steelhead, which are from here and then were planted there.
Interesting.
Um, and so the steelhead they're rainbow trout that migrate out to the ocean and then come back, as adults to
Hmm.
spawn. They're
Okay.
I would say they're probably very hard to target from a kayak just because the water they're in. Like the rivers that they run in are not, I guess you could do it, but you would have to have a shuttle system and it'd be a one-way trip. Like you're not going back up those rivers.
Gotcha.
So you know, it's a little more tricky. Um, People target salmon for sure from kayaks, and also sturgeon. The Willamette Columbia River has tons and tons of sturgeon in it.
I've
Um,
seen Mike McKinstry do an episode on that, and it always fascinated me. They're very like a prehistoric looking fish, almost.
yeah.
A really cool looking fish. I know in that episode he talks about having to handle them like super carefully. Like I think there you're not allowed to get them out of the water. You pretty much have to bring them up to your kayak. Keep them in the water, unhook them. You're allowed to get a picture with it in the water, but they have like really strong regulations on what you can do with them. Just because I guess their skin's like paper thin or something. I think I remember him saying so.
I'm not sure about the skin. I mean, I'm not saying that's wrong. I don't know, but for sure, there's a lot of regulations around, when there's a catch and release species, or it's the wrong variety of a species. So, for example, on that, we have native salmon and steelhead, but then we also have hatchery released salmon and steelhead, which they're released as like, smolt, like 2, 3 inches long, however. And
Yep.
then they live their lives for all intents and purposes. They live their lives as a native, but their fin is clipped. Their adipose fin on their, like, the littlest fin above their tail is clipped. And so when you catch them, you know that they're native or they're not. And when they're native, it's illegal to take them out of the water if you're fishing in an area where you're not allowed to keep a native. And
Gotcha.
so it's true with the sturgeon as well. But I mean, honestly, if you're on a kayak and you catch a sturgeon, the chances that you're going to even be able to get it out of the water are slim in the first place. And you're already right there anyway at water level, so it's it's pretty easy to just get your good picture and get it out. But sturgeon are really interesting, and I don't know the exact regulation, but because they get so big, there's a minimum size and a maximum size, and I want to say it's maybe the minimum is 48 inches, so 4 feet,
Wow.
and the maximum is 60 inches, and you can only keep them in that range in specific areas, specific times of the year, whatever the regulations allow. And I'm pretty sure, so it's like a 1 foot right there, but they get to be like 8 feet or 10 feet, and
I
and you
can't
can catch.
imagine. Yeah.
It's incredible. Yeah.
That's got to be like a sleigh ride for sure.
Oh yeah.
You're going where that fish wants to take you at that point.
100%.
Crazy. That sounds
Yep.
awesome. So, I was curious. You mentioned about the ocean being right there. Where
Mm,
where the rivers meet the oceans, is it mixed there? I know, like in Pennsylvania, not so much in Pennsylvania. I guess more in Maryland. We have like where the river meets the bay, and they call that brackish water. It's kind of a saltwater freshwater mix, and that's where like a lot of the striper action is. I know it makes for an interesting fishery. I know we used to crab there a lot because the crab species are one of the few that actually like that brackish water.
right. I mean, we don't have striper here, as far as I know. I think in Northern California, though, you can get stripers, so we're not too far from that. Um, I mean, ocean fishing for sure, and you can take your kayak out there. Some I'm not brave enough, or haven't been. It's a little rough. But yeah, I mean, you can go out and catch like rockfish and cod and lingcod and things like that.
Cool.
And then there is brackish water where the Columbia meets the ocean. Um, I don't know that there's fish species that people are targeting specifically because it's brackish water, though.
Okay.
Um, but
No, that makes sense. But it sounds like, I mean, you take the different rivers that you guys have and your reservoirs and lakes and stuff. You have quite a few different ways to fish. I'm kind of interested that the lakes, at least around here that I fish, they do stock trout in them, but I hardly ever catch them. Like, I know they're in there, but I just there's a few places in northern PA that I fish up near my hunting camp, and those are a few of the places that I've caught trout in the lakes. But at least down here in southern PA where I am, it's weird. You just don't see it as much, but I know they're in there because I know, one of the good baits to use as the water's kind of just starting to get warm is one of those, S waiver in a trout pattern or something.
right.
So I know, they're obviously in there because, those baits work good, but I just don't have a lot of, I haven't seen a lot of catches, but I also don't fish power bait or the things that I would normally fish for trout when I'm in those lakes.
Yeah, I think from a kayak, it's relatively easy, at least for me over here, to catch trout on the kayak. I mean, like, so trolling is huge. So a pedal drive is typically better just because you can really control your speed. Um, or a motor, obviously, because then you can really, really control your speed. But then you can paddle for them too. But the thing is I mean, really as simple as a spinner, a rooster tail spinner, a MEP spinner, anything like that. Your little trout that you would throw in a creek or a stream,
Hmm.
um, and just kind of figure. So what I do is I'll kind of toss it out so that it's casted, and then I like to count my strips. So because each one's like roughly 3 feet, right? So
Yep.
if you do 10 of those, you're 30 feet back roughly, and then you know, and then that's pretty much it. Drag it around. I mean, that's as simple as it can be. And in the early months, like right now, kind of early in the year when the water's still cool, they're pretty high up in the column. Generally, you can catch them shallow, so you don't have to do much work to get your lure deep at all. right? And you just drag it around, and you'll probably, if there's trout in there, you'll probably get some attention, you know. But then as the water warms, or if you do want to go deeper, what you can do is you can take one of those sliding, like, it's like a black slider deal with a clip on it, right? Like
Yep.
your little swivel clip, and run that on your line, and then tie that off to a swivel, or yeah, either a barrel swivel or a snap swivel, doesn't matter. And then on the back of that, tie another, say, 36 inches of line, and then tie your lure to that. And on that sliding dealie that you put on your main line, attach like a 1/8 ounce dropper weight, like just your simple little, those little weights that have like the coiled wire that goes in.
Yep.
Either that, or a 1/8, quarter, whatever it is you need, and do the exact same thing. But now you're just getting a little bit deeper. And if you need to get deeper, you can also go longer, which will help it get deeper, because the whole angle, right? It's
Right.
it's a balance, and you just kind of figure it out. It's like, well, I think they're deeper. Maybe you have a fish finder, or you're marking fish, but you're not catching any. Try to slow down. That'll help you go deeper. Speed up, more weight, whatever. You just figure it out, and trial and error. And you can do that same thing. And I forgot to mention in the kind of species list was kokanee as well, which I'd mentioned to you before. They're
Yep.
landlocked salmon, and people use different lures for them, but it's the same kind of approach, and you can catch in our lakes. So, if you're going to target trout, it's relatively simple, I think.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, now rooster tail is one of the. Actually, I started throwing it in the river for bass, and only because I was having like a horrible day, wasn't catching anything, and I had some rooster tails in my box from when I would go trout fishing, and I passed a guy on a kayak, and I just, hey, how making small talk, how's it going? He's like, oh, I probably caught 20. I'm like, 20? I haven't caught one. I was like, what the heck are you throwing? He's like, oh, just a rooster tail. I was like, what? And so he paddled on by, and I was like, I think he was like pulling my leg or something, one of those where I'm just going to tell this guy this is what I'm catching on. But I was like, you know what? I'll give it a try. And it was like crazy. I started catching bass. Now they weren't huge. I have caught, I think my biggest one on a spinner or a Meps is like, I think I had like a 19 or something. It's definitely, I'd say I catch more smaller fish on it, but if you're looking just to catch and just to have fun, that is one of the best baits I've found for the river, oddly enough. And
Yep.
so, when I run into somebody and they're having trouble, that's what I tell them to tie on, at least on the Susquehanna, because for some reason, I don't know why, it seems to catch bass. Again, people laugh at me when I say that sometimes, but I'm like, hey, that was my first confidence bait because it's easy to use. It's kind of hard to screw up. Now, I was curious though, when you talk about the grass and stuff,
Yeah.
because that isn't usually super grass friendly. At least for me, it isn't.
Yeah. But I think our lakes, at least where I would be in my kayak, is quite a bit deeper, and I wouldn't necessarily need to be where the grass is. I think the grass probably grows to like 10 feet deep, maybe,
Okay.
because it needs the sun,
Right. Yep.
to get there, right? And so, because like I said, it's like actual grass, like prairie grass, and so it needs that sunlight, as opposed to like, aquatic grass species that could grow in, probably a lot deeper. In any case, so I'm not really too concerned about the grass if I ever am trolling a
Gotcha.
spinner.
No, and that makes sense. And that's, I guess, would be where, the Susquehanna is a little different because we do get a lot of grass because it is so shallow, I think, and
Mhm.
it does have a lot of light permeation to it. So grass is a lot of very prevalent, and especially like they call it eelgrass or celery grass. It's very brittle, so you run a treble through that, and it just gathers
Yeah,
it like crazy, because it doesn't, it's not one of those where you just rip it out and it stays there and the lure comes clean. It just takes it all with it. So that was one of the hardest things for me to learn, because I'd watch all these videos and they're like, oh yeah, just rip it out of the grass, and I'm like, well, my grass doesn't work like that, but once I figured out what I can throw, so that's why I throw a fluke, or some of those really, really super weedless stuff in that kind of grass, and it works really well because there are bass in there. They love it, but just getting certain lures through it is a challenge. So
100%. the grass that I'm talking about too. Like it, you can find these places. Like there's a nearby lake that has this one spot, and I think I mentioned at the very beginning. I wanted to get my kayak over there. It's just so much. It's like it basically is a flooded prairie. It seems like back up in this pocket. And so for me, when I very first started, a weightless Senko was so ideal because you can Texas rig it and get no grass, but you can get it in these little pockets that you're like, oh, right over there, there's like this little hole in the grass, like a naturally created little spot, and you throw it in there, and sure enough, there's a fish in there. It's exactly where you'd think it would be. And so, I would say around here, in any of our lakes, a weightless Senko for anyone who's starting is just so dead simple. Once you learn how to rig it up, that's the hardest part. And then it's just a matter of throw it and just do nothing, and then until you're sure it's on the bottom, then maybe twitch it again, nothing, do it again in another spot. And so I think a beginner can do real well in our lakes around here with that, especially on the shore, like anywhere on the shoreline around probably between now and mid-June, when anytime they're kind of in that getting ready to spawn or post spawn, there's going to be
Gotcha.
fish around. Yeah.
No, and I 100% agree. That was probably confidence bait number 2 for me was the Senko. And when I go to I do youth Christian camp, I do a week as a camp counselor. And so that's a lot of times a lot of kids fishing. And so that is pretty much the bait I take with me. And I usually go to, Walmart and buy like as many of those Ozark Trail ones as I want, because they're not as expensive as like a Yamamoto Senko or anything. Even Yumdingers are a little more price competitive, but those kids, I tell them the same thing. I was like, cast it out and wait till your line goes completely slack and it's laying there on the bottom, then pop, 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 let it drop, pop, 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 let it drop. And they're like, oh, I caught one. It's great watching them catch it. So it's what I, kind of taught my kids to fish on too. Like I said, I think it's one of the best beginner baits there is. And especially, if you Texas rig it, it's dang near weedless too. So,
Oh yeah.
and
Absolutely.
snagless, you can drag that over a branch and, or rocks and not have it hang up a lot, so.
Yeah, I still throw that, and I throw it in the nastiest places that I don't want to throw anything else in for fear of losing. It's one of those things. It's like, well, throw it in there first and worry about getting the fish out after.
Yep.
You got
Yeah.
to get it bit first.
I forget who I was just listening to somebody, they were talking about, common mistakes anglers make. And that was one of the things that, the person mentioned. It was throwing in places where you don't know how you're going to get the fish out.
Mm,
He said, because obviously if you don't cast in there, you're not going to get a fish out.
right.
So if you're worried about getting the fish out, just give it a try and you'll be surprised, what you can work out. Now, it doesn't mean you're not going to, get them tangled and sometimes break them off in there. But still, if everybody who looks at that spot passes it up and says, I'd never get a fish out of there. And you're the one that tries it, you're going to be lucky more often than you're not. So it's
Well,
definitely.
sorry to interrupt, but
No, you're good.
the great thing about the kayak too, though, is that as opposed to a boat, you can probably get closer to that spot than a boat could. So you probably have a higher percentage chance of getting a fish out of there than they do, because first of all, they're not even maybe even going to be able to make that cast in there. But then you, especially maybe if you can stand, you might be able to leverage them up over a log or out of this weird thicket of junk, and they probably didn't even make a cast in there. So it's like, especially if you can get near a spot, what do you got to lose? I mean, you're going to lose like a 50-cent worm and a hook, worst case scenario, if you're throwing that lure.
Right.
So it's
Right.
like, it's worth it.
100% agree. And that was another thing that as a beginner, I really, it did take me a little bit to learn that, because I was very intimidated about getting snagged. And it was just like a mental thing, oh, I don't want to break off. I don't want to lose my lure. And, like you said, it really, when you think about it, it's pennies, maybe a couple of cents at the most, obviously if you're throwing like some of the, you don't want to throw a jackhammer in there, or you don't want to throw a Mega Bass Vision 110 around someplace you might not get it back a ton. But I mean, there's something to be said about having to risk that a little bit too. But yeah, with like a Texas rig Senko, might as well, worst case, you have to take a second and tie something on again. But
That's right.
that's a definitely low risk, high reward kind of situation, I think.
Absolutely.
Cool. Trying to think of anything else that we had mentioned that we were going to cover. I know. Oh, what's the tournament scene out there like? It, is it growing, or is it's still kind of in its infancy? I know you mentioned when you first started in like 2015, you didn't even know kayak fishing was a thing. So I was curious how that's changed since then, or if it is big. I know you don't hear a lot about, a ton of the big name trails going out there, but
Yeah, I personally don't participate in the tournaments, just because I just don't. I don't know. It is what it is.
right.
But we do have the, I believe it's Kayak Fishing Northwest is the tournament scene, and or the trail, and it's a combination of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, which that's kind of what we consider up here the Pacific Northwest, and sometimes British Columbia as well. If you want to throw that in there. And so they do tournaments throughout Oregon and some in Idaho and in Washington, and um, I think it is growing. I believe it was 2 years ago, I want to say, where they had their biggest to date. And it was some. I don't want to quote any numbers, but it was big. I remember being like, wow, that's a lot of people. And I also remember thinking like, oh, I've been to that lake. That seems like a lot of guys on that lake too. But that's great because it's just showing how many people there are. Um, that are into it. And yesterday I was out on the river and we ran into two other guys in kayaks. And I pretty much every time I go out, I see somebody on a kayak that's fishing, and generally bass fishing, because they're in the similar kind of areas I'm at.
Gotcha.
But I mean, overall too, if you get on any forums or anything like that, or just kind of just pay any attention, I think you'll see all kinds of people fishing for all kinds of fish from kayaks that they weren't before. Um, yeah, it's growing, and uh, I think it's the barrier to entry is so low. It's hard to it's really hard to afford a boat. And so if you want to get out on the water, a kayak is just so easy, and you can stumble into it like I did, and I think a lot of people do on
Hmm.
accident, and all of a sudden you realize you're in this world that is way bigger than you knew. Um, I see all the time online people asking questions about, this, like their Walmart kayaks or whatever. Like, hey, how can I rig this out? I got this kayak for super cheap, and it's like it's so great. So
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that's what I think is so great about this, because you can literally, for a pretty minimal investment, you still want to be, safe about it. And, you know, obviously now having been in some of the more expensive kayaks, I don't know that I necessarily would want to go back, but I still
that's right.
own a Pelican that my daughters use when we go out together. So if it gets you out on the water, I'm like 100% for it. And if it helps our sport grow, I was curious, like, do you have like a lot of paddle sports dealers, or how far do you have to go to get a kayak? Like, or do you like have box chains with like Dick's and Dick's Sporting Goods and that kind of thing, where they have them?
Yeah, I bought my first one from Dick's, but we do. So shout out to Next Adventure. Next Adventure is a big dealer here in the Portland area, and there's also one called, I want to say it's called Alder Creek Kayaks, maybe Kayak and Canoe, something like that. That's in the
Okay.
area. Um, but yeah, no, Next Adventure. That's who I ordered my Old Town from. There's this. They've got two actually specific kayak um, shops, and one of them is actually on the water. One of them's in downtown Portland. But the one on the water is great. You can go there and check out boats, whatever they have, that's in their kind of demo fleet.
Yep.
And so I checked out the Hobie that day. I checked out the Old Town. I checked out, I don't know, a new canoe maybe that day, something else. So yeah, that's great. And yeah, and they're dealer for all kinds of big brands, and so you can get stuff in and don't have to travel, super long distances to get anything.
That's
So
very cool. I mean, even I had to drive 3 hours to test drive a Hobie. I had a local dealer, but they didn't have any way to test drive. They're like, "Oh, we'll just put you up on the racks," and they have like these, kind of wood frames that they sit the kayaks on, and they're like, "Oh, it's you'll get a feel for it." I'm like,
mm,
that's not what it gonna feel like on the water." So, I drove to Delaware to actually test drive a Hobie before I bought one. So
Wow.
yeah, so even here in PA, you'd think that we would have you know a lot of access, but like I said, I had to drive a little bit. So but that's cool that it's readily accessible. So I'll definitely include some links to Next Adventure in Alder Creek. That's Alder, Alder.
Yep. Hmm.
Okay, cool. We'll make sure we include those so folks, anybody out in that area looking for a kayak or maybe wanting to demo can go check them out there. So
Yeah, it's called the Scappoose Bay Paddling Center. That's where you can go demo them. But
gotcha.
you'll find that on their website.
Okay,
But yeah,
cool.
it's great.
Very cool.
Hmm.
And so I guess you had that we kind of covered the different bodies of water. Obviously the Columbia and the other river you mentioned. I forget what the name of it was.
The Willamette.
The Willamette. Okay.
Yep.
And then tons of you know creeks and then also your reservoirs and lakes and stuff. That's kind of cool and relatively close. I mean, I know you said you drive an hour and a half for give or take, but that's more just to find your style of water or
That's right.
water that's not quite as crazy. So
Yeah, I mean, if you live, let's say you live in Portland, I think within an hour of any direction, if you go north, you go into Washington, which isn't a problem, but it's just that keep that in mind that you do need a Washington state license. You crossed a state line. But I mean, within an hour, any direction, there's for sure fishing opportunities, whether you have a kayak or not. And in bass fishing opportunities too. The Willamette River that runs right through town is packed full of smallmouth. I've had 50 fish days, like
awesome.
on the regular, especially in the summer. Now those 50 fish, they're not always the best fish. I've my two PBs on that are both over 20,
Okay.
which is they're great fish, but they're out of the thousands that I've caught. I've caught two
Mhm.
that are over 20. And I was screwing around with a friend one day and released one through my scupper hole. So that's the size you can get down to. 3, 4, 5 inch fish.
Oh yeah.
Uh, but
I mentioned going fishing today, and my two fish were probably one of them would have fit through the scupper, and the other was only 13. So
yeah,
definitely, there are times on the Susquehanna the same thing where you're going to weed through a lot of smaller fish to find those big ones, but they're in there if you take the time to weed through them. So
yeah. Hey, one other thing I wanted to mention too, on the Columbia specifically, is like I think I bought my first kayak in 2016, and it took me until I believe 2019. I went maybe once or maybe twice, and then really 2020 and 2021 before I felt really comfortable going out there. And the reason for that is so in this area, the Columbia is basically in a big canyon and is more or less a wind tunnel. It's known as like one of the like windsurfer like worldwide destinations for windsurfers and like kiteboarders and things like that.
okay.
And 10 miles an hour is no joke, really. And like the wind, right?
Hmm.
Because it doesn't like if you're on a little lake that you can get away from it, you can go in a cove, you can get behind some trees. It's completely exposed, and 10 miles an hour makes whitecaps, and it gets really, really gnarly. So just if people are going to go out there, just 100% make sure you check the wind forecast. It's a major thing, and also they can go on. I don't know the exact website, but the dam, multiple dams are run by the Army Corps of Engineers, and they've got a page that shows the actual discharge in cubic feet per second or whatever, or
Hmm.
what the dam's actually releasing. And so what's cool is you can go back and say, last week, what was it, and then what was it 3 days ago, what was it yesterday, so you kind of get an idea of the trend of their releasing, what the current's going to be like. And unfortunately, though, that doesn't really give you a good idea what the current's like if you've never been there. Like, you're not going to know what those numbers mean until you
Right.
sort of get out there and you realize, like, oh wow, 180,000 is a lot, and 100,000 is really nothing. It's like a lake,
Yep.
because there's just so much water that flows through there. So, but anyway, those are two major things, and you have to look out especially I'll go back to it, the wind. And right now we're like we barely crested 60 degrees, like only a couple times this spring. It's been a super cold spring, and the water still is like at 45, maybe 48 degrees. Yesterday I was out when I launched, it was 37 degrees at sunrise. And so, personally, my choice was that I wear chest waders and a semi-dry top for cold water gear. My buddy wears a dry suit.
Hmm.
Lots of people do,
Yep.
but your PFD, like I've almost turtled out there. it's it gets rough, so safety is huge. And if you go out there and you feel like, it's a little windy, I feel this like slight hesitation. It really is time to go. You're probably too late, actually. So I was so nervous for so long. And luckily, going out with some friends and that helps. But
No,
just
I,
be
I,
very aware.
100% get what you're saying. I do the same thing now, and made some foolish mistakes when I first started. And so now there's quite a few apps on the iPhone anyway. I know the iPhone store where you can get flows for rivers in your area. So I use that. There's a National Weather Service site I know in Pennsylvania that gives us our flow conditions. And I'll do some searching and find that Army Corps of Engineers site, and I'll make sure I put that in the show notes as well. Because that's definitely, like you said, it's super important, and it will take a little bit of kind of looking at it and going out and experiencing what the different flows are like. Because even on the Susquehanna, like where I am right now, it's 24,000 cubic feet, which is nothing. But I don't know that I would try and paddle anything over 65 in my area, but there's places where it's 65 is manageable because it's more of a lake area, and you could do okay out there, but there's also places where that would also be considered just insane.
Right.
So
Yeah, because it's not the speed of the water, it's the amount of water flowing. So as the river widens, there's more water. And so
yep.
the number can be really deceiving. And yeah, and that same advice for here goes if you're fishing on the Willamette too. That river gets really moving with the runoff. Um, and yeah, it's super dangerous. So just heads up. And yeah, the same sites are true. We've got river gauges all over the place in the USGS, the U.S. Geological Service. You can look at all these stats. I personally use the one from the Army Corps of Engineers because it's the
Gotcha.
nearest dam to me.
The closest one. Okay.
Yeah, and the closest one, it's probably a couple miles downstream of where I like to fish. So I do that, and because the next nearest marker or gauge is
Gauge.
at the next dam up, which is probably like 50 miles.
So that makes quite a difference. Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you kind of compare the two, you'll get a really good sense. But I don't know. Once I found that one for the dam, I really like it, so I go with that.
And another just little piece of advice, I know on the weather.com app, you can turn on small craft advisory, which
Mm,
at least on the Susquehanna is usually pretty indicative of when the wind is getting, to the point where it might not be the safest thing. So I did turn that on. So as soon as I log into the site and check the weather for my area of the river, if it'll tell me, and I want to say it's 12 miles an hour and up is what they consider small craft advisory. But it's the same thing. That's to the point where you're getting white caps, and it's probably going to be a washing machine out there a little bit. I have fished it a little bit in times like that, but it's definitely, especially if you're a beginner, I wouldn't recommend it. And it's funny because there's definitely been times where I've had friends, even I worked at a nursing home for a while, and there was a lady who worked in the marketing department. She's like, "Oh yeah, my husband and I just got kayaks. We're gonna go take them out tomorrow." It was like a Friday, and they're like going out on Saturday. I was like, "Whoa, where are you going?" She's like, "Oh, right down here." And I looked at the river gauge, and it was like blown out. And I was like, would not. And I showed her the app, and she's like, "Oh man, I'm really glad you told me that." Cause I've heard just this week, I heard of a guy who ended up sadly losing his life. He was out there without a life jacket. And we have low head dams in our area, which it allows water to flow over it, but it also is very dangerous for boats to go over it. And
Right.
if you don't know they're there, they're kind of hard to spot. It looks deceiving because it doesn't look like a big drop if a drop at all, but you can really, and the currents are just crazy around them. So every year we hear about, sadly, a lot of people lose their lives because they just don't know about it. And so it's definitely something to keep an eye out on. And definitely, if you have a chance, go with someone who knows the area, at least, the first time or two, just to kind of get the lay of the land. I think that's a huge help too. So,
Definitely. And actually, you mentioned like checking various apps. When I go out um, on the Columbia, I check four. I check because I think there's different, and I don't know the science of this, but there's different types of wind forecasts. Like they use different models,
mhm.
and so there's two apps and they're also websites. So I'm actually pulling one up right now just so I can look at them real quick. But okay, so there's Wind Finder and Windy. Those are two apps,
Okay.
and on Windy, you can there's 5 different variations of these different wind forecasts, and they're all slightly different. So I use both those sites, and I use Wonderground, which is a weather site, and I use AccuWeather, and I just look at them all real quick and just to be sure because it's like I don't want to have one tell me that it's going to be 5 miles an hour when the other three tell me it's going to be 10 and they're just using a different model. And so I just try to get the best representation, because it's spooky. I've been out there where the wind caught me off guard, and it's not, and I've had to pedal a mile or two upwind and down current, like or sorry, upwind up current, like they're both going the same direction, and it's a double whammy.
Oh
and
yeah.
um and so it's really rough. So anyway, so just check out all the information. Wind is the biggest one. The current's not going to get you in trouble out there. It never gets that crazy. You could paddle up it, it's not a problem. It's the wind that's going to get you.
And oddly enough, I know on the Susquehanna, a lot of times if the wind is going directly upstream against current, that makes it
Mm,
more choppy than anything, because it's crazy. It's nice because you don't necessarily, you can almost, if as long as you're okay being out in the washing machine, you don't necessarily go up or downstream. You can kind of stay in just one area because the
yeah,
current's pushing you and the wind's blowing you back against it. But it also makes it like totally white caps and pretty crazy out there. So, but I think that's a great idea just to get, because I've done the same thing. I've told the story on here a bunch, but I went out in the morning and I knew it was probably right about as strong as I would want to go out, but the forecast that I had read uh, called for it to die down, and so I went out and I was like, well, I'll just paddle upstream, and that way I know I can drift back down if I'm tired. Well, I went out. The wind was totally crazy, and it just got worse. And I tangled. I had a fish tangle my anchor line, so I pulled it all up in my lap, and I'm sitting there with this mess of stuff in my lap and trying to get it untangled. And here I looked up, and I had drifted way downstream past, and it was all I could do to make headway to get back to the launch where I went out of. And by the time I made it back to the ramp, I almost called my wife and was like, I don't know how you're going to get me, but you're going to have to figure out a way to get me because I don't think I can make it back to the truck.
mm,
And I did eventually make it back, but I was so exhausted I couldn't even lift my kayak into the back of my truck. I called a buddy and said, "Hey, can you come help me load my kayak?" Because my arms were just shot from just trying like anything I could to make headway against it. So you do really have to be careful.
I've had a similar experience where I was trying to get back to the launch. Had just stayed, I was catching fish, and it was like, oh, just one more, just 20 minutes or whatever, stay a little longer, and it just kept getting worse and worse. And so I finally, started making my way back, and um, I just couldn't. The wind was coming kind of at an angle to where I needed to go, say I needed to go north, and it was coming in at me kind of at this angle like that, and um, and it was blowing me off almost into the shore like repeatedly. And so I ended up just saying screw it, and I was about 3/4 of a mile from my car, and I bailed out and had to unload my entire kayak. I didn't have a cart with me. I trailer my kayak now, so I don't carry my cart. And so I had to unload my whole kayak, drag it up this embankment up to the road. Like, it was such a pain, but it was just that, like, I knew that I maybe could have made it to launch, but it was just too gnarly. Like it wasn't worth losing all my stuff and and flipping over. So I called it there, did that whole mess, walked to the car, got the whole thing, and went home. But it gets rough. So anyway.
Definitely, definitely. So, guys, learn from our mistakes. Make sure you check the apps. I'll try and include links to a bunch of these in the show notes, so check those out. But yeah, do whatever you have to do to be safe. We got lucky when we made these mistakes, but if we can save you from making the mistakes, that's definitely what we want to do. So, definitely make sure you go on and check that out before you hit the water, and just be as safe as possible. So.
Definitely.
Cool, man. Well, we're over an hour now. So, anything else that you want to? Any other places you want to give a shout out to? Any? I know you mentioned you didn't really have any sponsors, but any brand or anything specific that you love that I know you mentioned Old Town. You're a fan, but
No, I don't know. Just like shout out to fishing in the Pacific Northwest and shout out to this
yeah,
area. I think no hate here, but like, we often hear like, oh, going out west, but everybody's talking about California, right? Like they're half the West Coast. There's a lot of opportunity up here. Yeah, it's a little colder, it's a little rainier. Um, but it's great. There's so many opportunities. So if you get the chance to come out, then definitely do. I mean, almost you know any species you can target them from a kayak, and it's so much fun. So come out and enjoy it. And
well, it's definitely a new bucket list item for me. I've growing up, I was a Goonies fan, and I always wanted to go see the house where Goonies was filmed.
oh
And
yeah,
I told my wife someday we're going to do that. So now I'm going to have to make sure I fish when I go out there to visit the Goonies
oh,
house.
100%. Yeah, you can definitely go do it. They do get like, to anybody listening, don't be a weirdo because you can go check out the house, but people live in that house. Like it's just somebody's residence, and I've heard stories of them getting like a little, people being a little creepy.
Actually, I
So
just read an article that said somebody bought it that wants to turn it into a tourist
oh,
location.
okay.
Because I had read the same thing, that there was a family that lived there and was getting all sorts of crazy people coming, but I think someone else just bought it and for the purpose of making it a tourist place. I think I
Yeah.
read that. Don't take my word for it. Make sure you check it out before you go, but
Hey, one funny thing. So in that movie, for the Goonies fans out there, um, they ride their bikes from town to what's called Haystack Rock, that big rock that's in the ocean, right?
Mhm.
They ride their bikes there, and it's like, I don't know, they do it in 10 minutes or whatever in the movie. It's like a legit hour and a half drive. So to wreck anyone's anyone's memories of that, like, you would never, I mean, maybe somebody would, but, like, you and I wouldn't get on our BMX bike at 13 years old or whatever and
Right.
trek out there to that. Like, it's it's quite the journey.
That's funny.
So, yeah,
Cool,
but
man. Well, it's been fun, Luke. I appreciate you coming on, and definitely that's on my bucket list to come out. And maybe if I ever make it out there, I'll look you up and see what if we can do some fishing together. So
please do.
cool, man. Well, again, thanks for coming on. Oh, do you have any social media or anything that you care to shout out? If not, that's
Yeah,
cool. Okay.
sure. Just my Instagram. It's Luke_Johnston_PNW. And I'm not super active on there, but I mean, I'm on there, and I do post pictures of my catches and stuff like that sometimes, and like, nice sunrise shots and things like that, and anything that looks good. We've got some absolutely phenomenal scenery out here, so sometimes that's just the best thing to get some pictures of. So yeah,
Absolutely. Cool,
hit
man.
me up if anybody else wants to go fishing anytime, and they can find me on there. Then I'm happy to have more people to go out with and learn new things from them too, because like, I'm not the expert on anything for this matter. I'm just like kind of being the ambassador today of the Pacific Northwest, but like, yeah, there's people that know way more about all kinds of fishing than I do, so
Well,
I'd
they
love
need
to
a
learn from
voice
them too.
too. So yeah, yeah. Well, cool, man. Luke, again, thanks for coming on. I appreciate it. Guys, I'll put links to all the things we talked about in the show notes. So be sure and check that out. Hope to see a few of you guys this week at Dale Hollow. But until then, this has been the Bass Fishing for Noobs segment of the Paddle and Fin podcast, where we bring you the techniques, the tricks, and the tips to help you rip more lips. Luke, hang on for a little bit. I just want to have a little bit of follow up before we hang up here. But that's it for the show tonight, guys, and we'll catch you next week.